In a small corner of a quiet cafe there stood an old piano. Its wood was scratched, its paint faded, and its keys had turned a soft shade of yellow. It looked like something forgotten by time, a piece of the past that no one cared about anymore. People came and went, laughing, talking, taking pictures, but no one ever looked at that piano for more than a few seconds. It was just furniture to them, nothing more. Every evening, as the sun went down and the lights of the cafe began to glow warm and golden, an old lady would come in. She always wore the same faded gray coat, carried a small brown purse, and ordered a cup of tea. The staff knew her by face but not by name. She never caused trouble, never spoke much, just sat near the piano, looking at it quietly while stirring her tea. Sometimes, her fingers would twitch a little as if she wanted to touch the piano, but she never did. Maybe she was afraid no one would want her to play, or maybe she was holding something deep inside, a memory that hurt too much to bring back. Still, her eyes always lingered on the keys, like she was listening to something only she could hear. The younger crowd often noticed her. They would whisper and giggle, calling her the piano grandma. Some thought she was just lonely. Others believed she was waiting for someone. But no one ever tried to talk to her in their world of music apps, neon lights and fast laughter. She didn't belong. She was like a ghost from another time, sitting among them but not really part of them. The cafe itself had once been famous for live music years ago. Musicians from the city would perform there, and the old piano was once the heart of it all. But now times had changed, speakers replaced instruments, and the sound of digital beats filled the air instead of melodies played by hand. The piano's lid stayed closed, covered in a thin layer of dust, forgotten by everyone except the lady who sat beside it. One rainy evening, thunder rolled outside, and the crowd inside was larger than usual. The smell of coffee mixed with the scent of rain drifting through the open door. The old lady entered, as always, quietly. With that same soft smile that no one really noticed, she took her seat beside the piano, ordered her tea, and watched the people laugh. She seemed content, though her eyes told a story that no one cared to read. In the corner, a group of teenagers sat talking loudly. Their laughter echoed across the cafe. One of them noticed the old lady watching the piano again and whispered something to his friends. They all looked, chuckled, and made a few jokes about how she probably thought she could still play. They didn't mean to be cruel, but their laughter cut through the soft music playing from the speakers. It was the kind of laughter that can make someone feel invisible. The lady didn't react, she just smiled faintly and took a slow sip of her tea. Her hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from years of age and silence still. Her eyes stayed on that piano. Her reflection shimmered faintly in its black surface. And in that reflection she didn't look old. She looked peaceful, almost young again, as if a part of her still lived inside those forgotten keys. The rain grew heavier, tapping gently against the windows. The lights flickered once and the cafe grew dim for a moment. The sound of thunder filled the pause between laughter and music. In that silence, the old piano seemed to breathe again. It stood there waiting quietly as if calling to her. She finished her tea and placed the cup gently on the table. Her eyes drifted to the piano once more, and for a brief second her lips moved silently, like she was saying something, perhaps a name, perhaps a memory. No one noticed, but a faint smile touched her face. The kind of smile that comes when someone remembers something precious and painful at the same time. That night something changed in her eyes. The way she looked at the piano wasn't just longing anymore, it was decision. The quiet woman who had sat near it for months finally looked ready. Ready to touch the instrument she had avoided. Ready to let the music that had been locked in her heart find its way back into the world. No one in the cafe could have guessed who she really was or what story lived behind those trembling hands. To them she was just an old lady, but in truth, the piano in the corner wasn't forgotten. It was waiting for the one person who could still make it sing. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was her story. The next evening came with soft golden light spilling through the cafe windows. The sky outside burned orange and pink as the sun began to sink. The old lady entered quietly, as she always did. Holding her small brown purse close to her chest, her steps were slow but steady. Every customer in the cafe seemed lost in their own world. Some typing on laptops, others laughing over desserts. None of them noticed her at first, except the group of teenagers sitting near the counter. They remembered her from the night before. One of them smirked, whispering something to his friends. "There she is again, the piano grandma," he said. They all laughed softly, trying to hide it. but their voices carried across the room. The old lady heard them, but she didn't let it show. She walked to her usual table beside the piano, placed her purse gently down, and ordered a cup of tea with milk. The piano sat next to her like an old friend, its wooden frame glowing softly in the fading light. It seemed almost alive, as if it remembered the touch of her hands from another lifetime. The cafe's hum of voices and soft background music made the room feel warm. But something about that night felt different. The air carried a quiet tension, like the calm before a beautiful storm. The teenagers kept glancing at her, whispering. One of them, a boy with curly hair, finally stood up and walked over. "Hey, ma'am," he said with a grin. "You always sit by that piano. Do you even know how to play?" His friend snickered behind him. The old lady looked up slowly, her pale blue eyes calm and kind. "A little," she said softly. "Once upon a time." The boy laughed. "Once upon a time, huh? Why don't you show us then? Let's see what you've got." The cafe quieted slightly. The nearby tables turned their heads, curious. A few people chuckled. They thought it would be amusing. The old lady hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. For a moment it seemed like she would refuse, but then she placed the cup down gently and looked at the piano. Something changed in her expression. The kindness in her eyes turned to something deeper, something sharp, like a spark of memory catching fire. She rose slowly from her seat, the sound of her chair scraping softly across the floor. The room grew quieter. Even the cafe's music seemed to fade away. The young boy stepped back a little, unsure why he suddenly felt nervous. The lady walked to the piano and placed her wrinkled hand on its lid. The dust clung to her fingers as she lifted it open, revealing the keys that had been hidden for years. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. The black and white keys looked worn, but under the golden light they shimmered faintly. She brushed them with her fingertips, slowly, lovingly, as though greeting an old friend she had long missed. No one spoke. The laughter that had filled the cafe minutes ago was gone. The air felt heavier, waiting. The old lady took a deep breath and sat down on the bench. It creaked softly under her weight. She adjusted her posture, placing her fingers lightly over the keys. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, she played a single note, a sound so pure and deep that it seemed to hush the entire cafe. The note hung in the air like a whisper, then came another and another, forming a melody so gentle, so haunting, that even the noisy espresso machine seemed to quiet down to listen. The melody carried something no one could quite describe. It was sorrow, love, and beauty all woven into one. The teenagers stood frozen, their grins fading. The boy who had mocked her felt his throat tighten. He couldn't look away. The woman's hands no longer trembled. They moved gracefully, smoothly, with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering every key. The cafe owner stood at the counter. Staring in disbelief, the song filled the room like magic. Wrapping around everyone's hearts, the melody shifted, rising like a storm. Her fingers danced across the keys faster now. The sound was alive, bursting with passion and memory. People near the door stopped entering, drawn in by the sound. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" But no one could answer. The old lady's eyes were closed now. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm. The years seemed to fade away from her face. In that moment, she wasn't an old woman anymore. She was something timeless, powerful, and graceful, a soul speaking through music. When the final note came, it lingered in the air, trembling softly before fading into silence. The entire cafe was still. No one dared to breathe. Then slowly one person clapped, then another, and another, until the entire cafe erupted in applause. The lady opened her eyes and smiled, not with pride, but with peace. She looked at the young boy, whose eyes were wet with tears, and said softly, "Music never grows old, my dear, only people do." Then she stood up, closed the piano lid gently, and walked back to her seat. The cafe remained silent even as she left. The sound of her song still echoed in their hearts, and from that night no one ever laughed at her again. The following evening, the cafe was packed before sunset. Word had spread fast. Everyone wanted to see the mysterious old lady who had played the piano like a spirit from another world. The staff had polished the instrument, wiped away the dust, and even placed a small vase of fresh white lilies on top. It stood gleaming near the window like it had come alive again. The air buzzed with quiet excitement, but there was also a strange feeling of respect that hadn't existed before. The same teenagers who had laughed at her now sat in the corner, quiet, nervous, and embarrassed. They kept glancing toward the door, hoping she would come again. The cafe owner had even lowered the background music, leaving the piano silent but expectant. When the door finally opened, a soft chime echoed, and there she was, the old lady in her gray coat, her small brown purse hanging from her shoulder. Her steps were slow but steady, and though her face carried the lines of age, there was something radiant about her now, like the faint glow of someone who had finally found peace. People turned to look at her, and instead of laughter, there were smiles. A couple clapped softly as she passed by. She seemed surprised but nodded politely. She took her seat near the piano, as always, ordered her tea and looked around. For the first time in months, she noticed the piano was clean, shining and cared for. Her eyes softened, and she whispered under her breath, "Thank you," though no one heard it. The same boy who had mocked her before stood up and approached nervously. He held a single rose in his hand. His friends watched, wide-eyed, as he stopped in front of her. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, "I'm sorry for—" "You know what we said the other night." The old lady looked up. Surprised, her eyes kind. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said softly. "Music has a way of teaching lessons words never can." The boy swallowed hard, placed the rose on her table, and walked back. A hush fell over the cafe as she finished her tea. Her gaze drifted toward the piano again. Everyone could sense what might happen next. The owner quickly dimmed the lights, leaving only the warm glow from the hanging bulbs above her. It felt almost like a stage waiting for its performer. The lady rose slowly, every movement filled with grace. Her shadow stretched across the floor as she walked to the piano. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing anyone could hear. When she sat down and lifted the lid, the room seemed to hold its breath. This time, she didn't start gently. Her fingers struck the keys with purpose. The sound exploded into the air, strong, rich, alive. It wasn't a delicate tune tonight. It was bold and powerful, like thunder mixed with sunlight. Each note was sharp with emotion, pain, and pride. Her hands moved faster than anyone thought possible for someone her age. The crowd leaned forward, mesmerized. The music rose and fell like a storm, raging, beautiful, impossible to contain. Every chord carried a story, of love lost, of fame forgotten, of a heart that had survived when everything else had fallen away. The teenager sat frozen, unable to blink. The boy who had brought her the rose wiped his eyes quietly. As the melody built to its peak, her face changed, her eyes glistened. Her lips trembled with emotion. For a moment, she wasn't in that cafe anymore. She was back on a grand stage decades ago, dressed in silk, the crowd cheering her name. Clara Ivana, the world's youngest piano prodigy, the woman whose music once made audiences cry. She could almost hear the applause, feel the lights on her face, and the warmth of her husband's hand holding hers backstage. But then a shadow crossed her expression. The memory of loss crept in. The night she stopped playing, when grief silenced the music inside her. Her husband's sudden death had broken something so deeply that she had never touched the piano again. Until now, the music shifted softly, becoming slower, sadder. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. The melody carried her pain into the open, and the cafe felt it too. Some people quietly cried. Others just closed their eyes and listened. The sound filled every corner, wrapping around every heart. When the final note came, it wasn't loud. It was a whisper, like a soul finally finding peace. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat silently. The entire cafe stood, applause erupting like a wave. People shouted bravo, and some even called out her name, though none knew how they knew it. Clara Ivana. She smiled faintly, tears glistening on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't think I'd ever play again." The cafe owner stepped forward, his voice soft. "You'll always have a piano here." "Miss Ivana," she looked at him, surprised but touched, and nodded as she left that night. People parted to make way for her. Some bowed their heads slightly. Others simply smiled. The rose still lay on her table beside her empty teacup, and in the silence that followed her departure, the piano seemed to hum softly, as if the music still lingered within it, waiting for her return. The next night, the cafe felt different. It wasn't just a place to drink coffee anymore. It had turned into something sacred. People came not for conversation, but for silence. To sit where she had played, the air carried a hush, like everyone was waiting for something beautiful to happen again. The piano gleamed in the corner, its white lilies replaced with fresh red roses. The cafe owner had even lit small candles on the tables, their soft glow dancing like flickering hearts. By 7 o'clock, every seat was taken. Strangers sat side by side, their eyes glancing often toward the door, hoping she would return. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of rain, and the city noise seemed to fade as if even the streets were waiting. Then the bell above the door chimed. The old lady stepped in, wearing a pale blue shawl instead of her gray coat. She looked a little stronger, her eyes brighter. The crowd turned, and a murmur of warmth spread through the room. People smiled, some even stood up briefly in greeting. She seemed shy about the attention, her lips curving into a modest smile as she made her way to her usual seat near the piano. The same boy who had once mocked her now waited tables, trying to earn a little extra after school. When he brought her tea, his hands trembled slightly. "Good evening, ma'am," he said softly. She smiled. "Good evening, young man." He hesitated, then said, "Everyone's been waiting for you." Her smile deepened. "Then perhaps we shouldn't keep them waiting too long." But before she stood, she took a moment, closing her eyes and breathing in deeply. She could almost hear the faint echoes of yesterday's applause. It was strange, how music could make her feel both alive and fragile at once. For decades she had carried her silence like a heavy coat, and now every note she played seemed to peel away the years of sorrow. When she rose and walked to the piano, no one dared to speak, even the barista froze mid-pour. The candlelight shimmered on the polished surface of the piano as she lifted the lid again. This time she didn't hesitate at all. Her hands found their place as if drawn by destiny. The first notes were soft, gentle as rain falling on glass. The melody fluttered like bird wings, light and uncertain, then slowly began to rise. The crowd leaned in. Each note seemed to build on the last, her music painting invisible colors in the air. It wasn't just beautiful, it was alive. Breathing, growing. The melody shifted. Turning playful, joyous, her fingers moved faster now. Gliding across the keys with youthful grace, the crowd watched in awe. She played not like an old woman, but like a girl remembering her first dance, her first laugh, her first kiss. Her music told stories without words, of joy rediscovered, of light after darkness. Halfway through the song, something magical happened. A little girl, no older than 7, walked up quietly and stood beside her. The girl's parents tried to stop her, but the old lady smiled and nodded softly, inviting her closer without missing a beat. She shifted the melody into something simpler, slower, guiding the girl's small hands onto the keys. The cafe held its breath as the two played together. One old, one young, the contrast was breathtaking. The lady's seasoned hands moved with mastery, while the child's tiny fingers hesitated, yet followed bravely. Together, they created a duet so tender it felt like time had stopped. The music wrapped the room in warmth, a bridge between generations, between past and future. When the song ended, the little girl looked up at her with wonder. "How do you make it sound like magic?" she whispered. The old lady smiled softly. "Because music is a heartbeat, my dear. You just have to listen." The crowd clapped, some standing, others wiping tears. The girl's parents thanked her, and the old lady simply nodded, placing a gentle hand on the child's head before she returned to her seat. Afterward, the cafe buzzed quietly with emotion. People didn't talk about fame or skill. They talked about feeling. The boy waiter turned to the owner, whispering, "It's like she's teaching us something we forgot." The owner nodded slowly. "She's reminding us what it means to be human." Later that night, when the crowd thinned, the old lady sat alone beside the piano again. The candles had melted low and the air was thick with the scent of wax and roses. She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph, a man standing beside her younger self, both smiling before a grand piano. Her hand trembled as she touched the edge of the picture. "You were right," she whispered softly. "Music never leaves, it just waits." Outside, the rain began to fall again, soft and steady. Through the cafe window, the piano's reflection shimmered beside hers, and for a moment, it looked as though two people sat there again, the woman and the man she once loved, listening to the music that would never die. The next evening arrived under a sky painted with streaks of violet and gold. The cafe glowed from within like a lantern in the night, and by now, people weren't just coming for coffee, they came for her. Word had spread beyond the neighborhood. Musicians, students, even a few reporters had shown up. The piano, once forgotten, had become the heart of the cafe, and she its quiet queen when she entered. The bell above the door chimed, and everyone turned. The young waiter, the same boy who had once laughed, was the first to greet her. "Good evening, Miss Ivana," he said proudly. The old lady smiled at the sound of her real name. It had been years since anyone had said it aloud. She nodded politely, her eyes soft with warmth. "Good evening, dear." She sat down, sipping her tea slowly, glancing at the piano as if it were a living thing. The red roses still sat atop it, and next to them was a small card that read, "For Clara Ivana, who reminded us what beauty sounds like." Her lips trembled at the words, and for a moment she had to look away. Then something unexpected happened. A man entered the cafe carrying a violin case. He was tall, with gray in his hair and tired eyes. But when he saw her, he froze. The crowd parted slightly, sensing the shift. The man whispered, "Clara?" She looked up, startled. Her teacup rattled in its saucer. "Elias?" she breathed. He smiled, almost disbelieving. "I thought you were gone." She stood slowly, her eyes shining. "So did I," she said softly. The cafe fell silent as they met in the middle of the room. Two old musicians standing face to face after decades apart. Years ago, Elias had been her duet partner. They had toured together, played side by side in orchestras across Europe, until the night her husband died and she vanished, leaving the stage and her music behind. He had searched for her for years, never knowing she had been living quietly, teaching music to children and hiding from her past. "I heard the stories," Elias said, his voice low, "but I never believed you'd stopped playing." She smiled faintly. "Grief has strange hands, Elias. It can silence even the strongest melodies." He nodded, setting the violin case down. "Then let's bring it back together. One last time." A murmur rippled through the crowd as he opened his case and pulled out a violin that looked nearly as old as the piano itself. The wood gleamed under the lights. She hesitated. "It's been so long." He raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Your fingers remember, Clara. They always will." The crowd watched in hushed anticipation as the two took their places. Clara at the piano, Elias beside her with the violin under his chin. They exchanged one final look, and then, music, it began softly. A conversation between strings and keys. His violin sang like wind through trees, and her piano answered, deep and warm like the earth beneath it. Their sounds intertwined, dancing around each other, growing louder, richer, stronger. The room was spellbound. Every note carried history, pain, laughter, and reunion. People held their breath as the duet swelled into something divine. It wasn't a performance, it was a story being told without words. A story of two souls separated by time and tragedy, finding their way back through music. The violin cried and the piano comforted. The melody rose like dawn breaking after a long night. By the final movement, tears were falling freely around the cafe. The boy waiter stood frozen behind the counter, unable to look away. The little girl from the night before sat near the front, holding her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with wonder. When the last note came, it was so delicate that it almost didn't sound real. Like a sigh carried by the wind, Elias lowered his bow slowly, and Clara's hands rested on the keys. Her chest rose and fell as if she had just run a great distance. They looked at each other, tears shining in their eyes. The cafe erupted into applause, deafening, thunderous, heartfelt. People stood, clapping, cheering, crying. Some shouted her name, others simply pressed their hands to their hearts. Clara smiled through her tears, turning to Elias. "You were right," she said softly. "Music does remember." He nodded. It never forgets its players. Afterward, they sat side by side, sipping tea as people came one by one to thank them. The cafe owner approached, his eyes glistening. "You've given us something more than music," he said quietly. "You've given us hope." Clara looked at the piano, her reflection glimmering in its polished surface, and whispered, "No, my friend, the piano gave me back to the world outside." The night was cool and calm. The sound of rain returned, tapping lightly on the glass inside. The two old musicians sat together, smiling in silence, as the cafe glowed softly around them, a temple of memory, forgiveness and music reborn. The next morning, the cafe owner found something incredible waiting outside the door. A small crowd had gathered even before sunrise. Reporters, students, and local musicians were talking excitedly. Someone had posted a video of Clara and Elias's duet online the night before, and it had gone viral overnight. The headline read, "Two forgotten musicians reunite, their song made the world cry." By noon, the cafe was overflowing. News vans parked along the street. Cameras flashed and people held flowers. Everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of the woman whose music had awakened hearts. Inside, the old piano had been moved to the center of the room, its keys polished until they gleamed like pearls. A single spotlight shone softly on it. Waiting for her. When Clara arrived that evening, she was stunned by the sight. She had expected the usual small crowd, not this sea of faces. People clapped the moment she stepped through the door. Some even called out her name, "Miss Ivana. We love your music. You made us cry." She froze for a second, her hand gripping her purse. Her eyes shimmered with disbelief and humility. She wasn't used to being seen anymore. The cafe owner hurried over, smiling proudly. "Clara, you've become the soul of this city overnight." She shook her head gently. "I only played what my heart remembered," he smiled. "That's exactly why they're here." Elias was already inside, tuning his violin. When he looked up and saw her, his expression softened. "You've caused quite the storm," he teased. She chuckled quietly. "I always preferred small audiences." "You won't have that luxury tonight," he replied, nodding toward the crowd as they prepared to play again. Clara noticed a few people in the front row holding old vinyl records, her albums from the 1970s, worn and scratched but treasured. One woman even had a framed concert ticket from Clara's last performance decades ago. "We never stopped listening," the woman whispered tearfully. Clara's lips quivered and she placed her hand gently over the woman's. "Then I never really disappeared, did I?" When Clara sat down at the piano, the room went still. Cameras pointed toward her. Lights glowed softly, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Elias nodded, raised his bow, and began the first note. This time, their music was different. It wasn't sorrowful or nostalgic. It was triumphant. The melody rose like sunlight breaking through clouds, every note ringing with the strength of survival and love rediscovered. Her fingers danced with renewed fire. His violin answered in harmony, weaving through her rhythm like two souls that finally found peace after a lifetime apart. People wept openly, but they also smiled through their tears. Couples held hands, strangers embraced. The little girl from before sat in the front row, swaying to the rhythm, whispering to her mother, "It sounds like hope." Outside, more people gathered by the windows. Some stood in the rain just to listen. The music spilled out into the street, reaching those who couldn't fit inside. The sound of the piano echoed through the night air, bouncing off buildings and drifting through the city like a message carried by wind. Halfway through the performance, Clara felt something stir inside her chest. Not pain, not fear, but peace. For years she had locked her music away, believing she'd buried it with her husband. But now she understood that grief had never taken it. It had only hidden it, waiting for her to be ready. She closed her eyes as the melody swelled, remembering the man she had loved, the life they'd shared, and the silence that followed his loss. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her hands never faltered. Every note she played felt like a conversation with him, one final duet across time. When the piece ended, there was no immediate applause, just stillness, a sacred kind of quiet that wrapped around the room. Then came the sound, soft clapping at first, then roaring applause. People stood cheering, crying, shouting her name. Someone from the back yelled, "Encore!" and laughter rippled through the room. Clara turned to Elias and smiled through her tears. "It feels different tonight," he nodded, "because tonight, you're not playing alone anymore." She looked at the faces around her. Young, old, strangers, friends, all united by the same heartbeat, and she finally understood what her music had done. It had healed not just her, but everyone who had listened. As the night drew to an end, the cafe lights dimmed. The crowd slowly began to leave, but no one wanted to break the spell. People whispered softly as if leaving a cathedral. Clara remained seated by the piano, her hands resting on the keys. Elias packed his violin but lingered beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly. "That maybe music doesn't belong on stages or in fame, it belongs here in small rooms, in quiet hearts." He nodded. "Then this cafe is the perfect place." Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets were wet. Glowing under the lamplight, inside the piano gleamed like it was alive. And for the first time in many years, Clara Ivana felt whole again. Her silence had become a song, and that song was now eternal. The next day, dawn broke with soft golden light spilling over the streets. The cafe owner stood outside early, unlocking the door and smiling at the line of people already waiting. Word had spread far beyond the city. Clara Ivana's performance had reached hearts across the world. News channels called her the lost virtuoso found again, while online, millions watched the viral videos with tears in their eyes. By evening, the cafe overflowed once more. Musicians had come from other towns. Students carried notebooks hoping for a chance to learn from her, and even elderly couples who remembered her from the old concert days had traveled hours just to see her play one last time. The air inside was electric with anticipation. But there was also something gentle, something sacred, as though everyone understood this night was special. When Clara arrived, the crowd erupted into applause, cameras flashed. But she didn't flinch this time. She smiled warmly, greeting people as she passed. Her old gray coat had been replaced by a long navy shawl, and she looked radiant, calm, and confident. The years no longer weighed on her. They seemed to have melted away beneath the light of rediscovered purpose. The boy waiter met her at the table, placing her favorite tea down with a grin. "You've become famous." "Miss Ivana," he said. She chuckled softly. "Fame is a funny thing, dear. It disappears the moment you chase it. But it finds you when you stop running." He nodded, not fully understanding but feeling the wisdom in her tone. The piano waited for her as always, its black frame gleaming beneath the cafe's warm lights. The flowers beside it had multiplied, roses, lilies, even wildflowers from local gardens. People had begun leaving them as offerings of gratitude. The sight brought a tear to Clara's eye. "I suppose I'll have to learn to share my stage with flowers now," she whispered, her voice soft with humor and warmth as she prepared to play. Elias approached her, violin in hand. He looked more peaceful than before. His face carried that same quiet joy that came only after years of struggle and reconciliation. "Are you ready for tonight?" he asked. She smiled. "I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it when they took their places." The lights dimmed and silence fell this time. Clara didn't begin with an old composition. Instead, she started playing something new, something born right there in that cafe. Her fingers moved with confidence and tenderness, weaving a melody that no one had ever heard before. It was raw, honest, and alive. Elias joined her, his violin lifting the melody higher. The two of them played as if they were speaking a language older than words. It wasn't just music anymore, it was gratitude, forgiveness, and rebirth. The rhythm swayed between soft whispers and powerful crescendos, carrying the audience through emotions they didn't have names for. Halfway through the song, Clara paused briefly and turned toward the crowd. "This piece," she said gently, "is not from the past. It's from now, from this place, from you." Then she pressed her hands back to the keys, and the music surged again, bright and warm like sunlight after rain. The cafe filled with emotion. People held each other's hands, some cried quietly. Others smiled through their tears outside. Passers-by stopped at the windows, listening through the glass. The melody wrapped around the street, spilling into the night like a heartbeat. As the final notes neared, Clara slowed her tempo. Her hands softened, the sound grew faint, fading into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the entire cafe stood, thunderous applause echoing like a wave. The sound carried out into the street. People shouted her name, "Clara! Clara!" Some even cried, reaching toward her. She rose slowly, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving music a home again." Elias placed his hand on her shoulder and said softly, "No, Clara, you gave us our hearts back." The cafe owner stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "Miss Ivana, we want to honor you." He turned toward the crowd and lifted a small golden plaque that read, "Clara Ivana Piano Hall, where music found its way home." The audience cheered, and Clara covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Her tears fell freely now. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. The owner smiled. "You do." More than anyone, the rest of the evening felt like a dream. People lined up to shake her hand. Children asked for lessons. Musicians wanted to collaborate. But Clara's heart was quiet, content. She knew she didn't need fame or glory anymore. She had something far greater. Later that night, when everyone had gone and the cafe was empty, she sat at the piano one last time. The candles flickered low. She played softly, just for herself. The notes drifted gently through the quiet room, light as feathers. Her reflection shimmered in the piano's black surface, and beside it faintly, she imagined the smiling face of her husband listening. "See," she whispered, "I told you I'd play again." Outside, the night was still. The cafe's sign glowed softly under the streetlights. Clara Ivana Piano Hall. Inside, the last note lingered in the air like a promise, a final whisper of love, art, and the magic of never giving up on what truly lives inside the heart. The next morning dawned bright and quiet. The cafe was closed, its chairs stacked neatly, the floor shining from last night's cleaning. Outside, a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of roses left by visitors. The sign above the door now read, Clara Ivana Piano Hall, glowing softly in the sunlight. For the first time in years, the street itself seemed to hum with peace. Inside, the piano sat alone in the center of the room. The candles had burned out, leaving only small trails of wax. The vase of flowers beside the piano had been replaced with dozens more, some from strangers, some from people who had traveled across towns just to say thank you. Each one carried a little note. "Your music healed me. You reminded me of my mother. You brought light back into my world." That afternoon, Clara arrived quietly, wearing a soft cream shawl and carrying her brown purse as always. The staff rushed to greet her, but she raised a gentle hand and smiled. "No fuss today, my loves. I just want to play." She walked to the piano slowly, running her fingers across its smooth edge. The instrument seemed to recognize her touch. It almost shivered under her hand. The cafe owner approached. "Miss Ivana, the city mayor called this morning. He wants to name this place a cultural landmark." She smiled softly. "That's very kind. But music doesn't belong to mayors. It belongs to people." He laughed. "Then the people have already done it. They've made you immortal." Clara chuckled quietly. "Immortality is overrated. I only ever wanted peace." Her voice carried no regret, only calm acceptance. She sat down at the piano and began to play, softly at first. The melody that filled the air was new yet familiar. It felt like the closing of a long story. Her fingers glided gently over the keys, her touch lighter than ever before. The sound was like morning light through leaves, gentle, warm, peaceful as she played. The boy waiter entered, his apron still tied. He froze in the doorway, listening soon. The other staff gathered around too, no one speaking, just listening. Her music drifted through the cafe and out into the street, drawing people in like a quiet miracle. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered outside, pressing their faces to the windows. The people who had heard her play before recognized the sound immediately. Some began to cry softly. Others just closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them. It was the sound of farewell, gentle but full of love. Inside, Clara's face glowed softly in the golden light. Her eyes were closed, a peaceful smile resting on her lips. Each note felt like a heartbeat, slowing, steady. She played not for applause, not for fame, but for memory, for her husband, for Elias, for every soul who had ever listened and felt something stir inside. When the song ended, she rested her hands on the keys, the last note lingering in the air like a breath. The cafe was silent. Everyone stood frozen in awe. Then slowly, she opened her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for listening." Her voice was soft, almost fading into the sound of the piano's last echo. The boy waiter stepped forward. "Miss Ivana?" "That was beautiful." She smiled gently. "Every song must have its ending, dear." He frowned slightly. "But endings are sad." She shook her head. "No. Endings are simply beginnings in disguise." That night, when the cafe closed, Clara lingered for a while. Alone with the piano, she played one final time, a quiet lullaby meant only for herself. The moonlight poured through the window, turning her silver hair into threads of light. When the last note faded, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against the piano, and whispered, "Thank you, old friend." The next morning, she didn't come. The cafe owner grew worried, so he went to her small apartment nearby. He found her sitting peacefully in her chair, a faint smile on her face, and the photograph of her husband resting in her lap. She was gone, but she had gone beautifully. Like music fading into silence, the news spread quickly. The cafe filled with flowers again. People came not to mourn but to celebrate. Someone placed a sign on her chair that read, "She played her last song, but the world is still listening." From that day on, the piano remained in its place, polished every morning, played by musicians young and old, The plaque on the wall grew surrounded by photographs and letters. The cafe became a pilgrimage for anyone who believed in second chances, and every evening, just before closing, the boy waiter, now grown older, would sit by the piano, press one soft key, and swear he could still hear her melody faintly answer back. Outside, the city glowed under twilight. Inside, the old piano waited silently, alive with echoes of her spirit. For though Clara Ivana's hands were gone, her music, her heart played on forever, whispering to every soul that walked through those doors, reminding them that beauty never dies, it only changes its tune.